and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Joining me in the studio today to discuss the thinking and strategy behind Budget 2025 and to share the government's long-term economic vision for Malaysia, we have Norhisham Hussein, who is the Senior Director of Economics and Finance in the Prime Minister's Office. Hisham, welcome to the show. It's good of you to join me. Thank you for being here today.
You're welcome. It's always great to be here.
There's so much to cover in the time that we have, but I thought maybe we could start with the around 95 targeted subsidy, because that seems to have dominated public discourse when it comes to Budget 2025. It's generated a lot of discussion, but it's also generated quite a bit of anxiety amongst Malaysians who are worried about the way it might impact them. And I wanted to ask you, Hisham, how, in terms of when you think about the main concerns that Malaysians have, what do you believe them to be concerned about? And do you think that these concerns are justified?
Thanks for the question. I think, yes, out of all the items in the budget, I think this is the one that created the most conversation for obvious reasons. It affects all of us. The concerns people would have, I would say that given that I think public transport ridership is still relatively low, a car is still a requirement, or a motorcycle is still a requirement for many people to travel around, to get to work, to do their various chores or what have you, send their kids to school. It is something that will impact everybody's wallets. So for obvious reasons, it's going to be a concern for everyone, especially if I think, you know, most people, what they do is that they set their standard of living based on what they're able to afford. And anytime the cost changes, that will have an impact, I think, in terms of their decisions, in terms of what they will be able to afford. Like I said, it hits everybody's wallets. So yes, there are a lot of concerns, there's a lot of anxiety out there, very understandable. I think the government is very mindful of the fact that this will have an impact on a lot of people. We have, I think, 17 million vehicles or whatever the number is, and it's
but the bottom line is we need to do it anyway. Yeah,
and because the flip side is, I think the latest IMF estimate of how much fuel subsidies actually cost the country is something on the order of $80 billion a year. It's a huge number. And the fiscal cost is only one quarter of that. I mean, that's one small portion of that. The non-fiscal aspect of it, the non-financial impact of all this is quite significant. So we have to do this. And not just for the fiscal side of things in terms of, you know, generating savings so that we can fund other priorities, but also I think in terms of very mindful of the impact on the other aspects of the quality of life, the environment, congestion, productivity, all those things matter as well.
Okay. Well, tied to the conversation about the targeted subsidies for RAW 95 has been this category of T15. This term has suddenly generated so much interest, and I do want to ask you what you make of this current discourse.
I think it's quite interesting in the sense that people are starting to realize that just income categorization itself is insufficient. I think we do need to relook at how we approach targeting, because there is so much differences between households in Malaysia. You know, just as an example, okay? You know, people think of the family unit as being 2 adults and 1 or 2 children, right? But that's 18% of households only. So there's a lot of, you know, there's single-person households, there's households with 20 people in them. And trying to account for all of these differences, I think is something that we would need to try to do. Having said that, I don't think there's a system that will perfectly capture the circumstances that everybody has. I know people who commute from Seremban to KL, for example, for work every day. So, you know, if you say, okay, we need to take into account geographical differences in cost of living. So which one do you count in that example? Seremban or KL?
Right.
You know, so, and of course, obviously you got differences, I think, in terms of housing costs, in terms of, you know, transportation costs and all of that. It's very difficult to come up with a system that takes into all of that into account. Having said that, we do need to really look at household composition seriously, because that has a huge factor, I think, in terms of what households actually need to spend. There's a huge difference between somebody who's earning 12,000 ringgit and all, he's taking care of himself, versus, 12,000 ringgit and he's taking care of 4 kids.
Right. So if income categorization is insufficient, how do you, what are the key considerations that go into thinking about ensuring that when targeted subsidies are finally rolled out, that it is fair, that it is equitable?
Yeah.
I mean, the way you're describing it, the heterogeneity of households, it's impossible to take into account everything.
Yep.
But we want to do this by mid next year.
Yes.
And we want it to be fair, so it's as painless as possible,
Yep.
but with the least amount of political capital impact.
Yep.
How do we think about that?
Very, very difficultly. The reality is that there's no good level to look at. I think it's a question of where we think a fair line can be crossed, but fair is a relative, I think, matter. It depends on where you are.
It's the point of view, right?
Very much so. And again, it goes back to your particular household circumstances. If you travel a great deal for work, for example, just take Grab drivers, right? Even though their income categories would be somewhere in the B40, M40, if you look at it from a household perspective, they use a lot of fuel, right? And I think certain other categories of workers also, for example, if you're traveling a great deal, sales or that sort of thing, or you do a lot of, I think, project work in various different places, right? You do travel a great deal, and that will have an impact. And unfortunately, no system will be able to take that into account. Where we draw the line, I think that's under active discussion. Okay. Where we think is fair, I think we probably need to move away from subjective values like rich and not rich, and because those are, again, very relative. It depends on where you are, depends what your standard of living actually is, depends what your commitments are.
You don't like the term T15 then?
I would say, because it would depend on what kind of basis you're looking at. So if we were using, for example, the household income category, that's fairly straightforward, but it's not really fair. If we look at it from a per capita basis, that's a bit more accurate, but again,
per capita. Okay.
Yeah, the categories will shift a great deal. And I think one concern that I have is that when we change the basis of categorization, there will be a lot of movement. There will be a lot of movement between the different categories. Yes. So T20 under household income category is roughly around 12,000, just under 12,000 ringgit,
12,
right?
Okay.
If you use on a per capita basis, that figure falls to 4,004.
Wow.
And if
that's a big difference.
That's a huge difference. And if you use, say, for example, Padu, which is a lot more granular, there's going to be even more movement between different categories. So if I went from household, just basic households to per capita basis, roughly about 40% of the T20 drop below.
Understood.
But on the other hand, because you've got people dropping below, you also have people moving up. So there's actually something like 4.5% of B40 going into the T20 category. It happens. There's about 15% of M40 that goes up into...
the movement is both ways.
There's a lot of movement both ways, yes. So we have to be very careful about what we do, because if we change the basis of how we approach, how we give out benefits, there will be significant changes, I think, in current benefits as well. And that's something we have to approach very carefully.
Okay. So you say that, this is all still on the table. You've got the best minds in PMO, I hope, thinking about this.
Well, and EPU, and MOF.
All the best minds in government thinking about this. Yes. But what are you considering? I mean, these are many variables. How do you make sure that you're mitigating some of the exclusion rates, the impact of this, the unintended consequences? How do you avoid blind spots?
I think the best fit for the majority. I think
the best fit for the majority.
We have to do it on that basis. You can't go on marginal cases like, if I'm a single income owner, I'm taking care of 7 kids on my own, I'm in the T20 category, that's 0.1% of the population. Yeah. So we can't cover all the cases, but we have to basically look at the best fit. So 2-income households, 3-income households, which is quite common actually.
3-income households?
Yes. Especially in T20, there's a lot of 3-income households. We have to be able to fit those categories. If we can hit maybe 70–80% of the households correctly, I think we're doing great.
Okay, all right. So can I ask you about the subsidy, the diesel subsidy reform that was, I think was last June, wasn't it? Was rolled out. We've had a couple months since it's been implemented. What lessons have you learned from that rollout and the subsequent implementation of it?
I would say overall it went pretty well.
Okay.
I think from an operational perspective, I think we hit what we needed to hit. I think from an objective standpoint, we seriously dented smuggling.
Okay, so that was essentially targeting leakages for diesel.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And in a certain sense, I think when we do Norhisham 95, it will be the same approach. We're looking at the leakages more than anything else, because a lot of diesel smuggling has now shifted to petrol smuggling, because there's still a significant price differential between Malaysia and the rest of ASEAN. I think Thailand is, Indonesia is around 4 ringgit 40 cents now. Thailand slightly higher. Philippines is roughly around the same ballpark. So there's almost a 2 ringgit differential between our price and outside. So the smugglers have shifted to petrol rather than diesel now. So I think we continue to look at, I think the main target, if we can get a handle on smuggling, I think as far as Norhisham 95 is concerned, we probably achieved the objective that we were looking for. So if that means that, for example, we raise the T15 to T5 or T1 or whatever, as long as we get rid of the smuggling, I think we've achieved what we wanted to do.
Okay, so probably might be at the very, very top that you're focused on. Can I ask you, I mean, I know a lot of people are quite anxious looking at any kind of developments with the RON 95 diesel announcements, sorry, RON 95 subsidy announcements. There are those who are saying, well, oil prices are low now. Why do we want to wait a year and a half before we kickstart this? Why not do this now and figure it out while prices are low?
I think in that sense, I think that there is, we have to figure out the operational approaches to this, make sure that it works, it's tested, it's as painless as possible, because it's not easy to do stuff like this where you're trying to identify people. And we have to have at least a 2 or 3 month period where people need to potentially update the registration in Padu if we go the Padu route. So there's still some operational issues that we need to iron out. I think also, even though oil prices are low now, we don't know where they're going to be in the future. Right now, I believe the differential right now is roughly about 70 cents. Okay. Yeah. So it's still significant, right? You could go the route of, just, as some are suggesting, just float everything, but I think that's too harsh and too big of a shock to the economy. Yeah. So regardless of where the oil price actually is, we do need to shift away from universal subsidies regardless.
Okay, all right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the revenue side. Wanted to ask you about Malaysia's tax to GDP ratio, which I think so in budget 2024, it was estimated to be stagnant this year, so stagnant this year, expected to be stagnant next year as well. And this is despite we're thinking about growth in some of the tax collections. How do we think about that? I'm really perplexed at why we're in this stagnant rate and what challenges that poses for funding, funding national priorities. Yeah,
it's actually quite interesting because it's a multifaceted problem. It's not just one thing. Okay. There's a number of issues here. One is, I think, some of the incentives that we provide to industry is an issue.
Incentives in what way?
Well, tax incentives we give to pioneer companies, FDI, things like that. They're actually quite hefty. Whether that's actually under review right now, whether these need to continue in the current form, or some of these really need to be sunset. Okay. The other issue, I think, is that the structure of the economy itself has changed. So if you look back over the last 40 years or so, going back to the 1980s, the proportion of indirect taxation was substantially higher than it is today. I think it's roughly about 3 times higher than it is today.
Oh, wow.
So the actual drop in the tax to GDP ratio is largely due to the drop in indirect tax collection. A couple of things here. One is that because the sales and service tax is relatively limited, you know, it's a positive list. When the economy structure changes, then and we don't change the structure of the sales and service tax, then the ratio will drop for sure. The second thing is that over the years, because there's been a lot of trade liberalization under WTO and various free trade agreements and all that, export-import tariffs have dropped, export and import duties have dropped substantially. So that's caused the indirect, because if you actually look at the breakdown, individual income tax, corporate income tax have been relatively stable as a ratio to GDP, but indirect taxation is where the drop has actually occurred.
Okay.
So we need to look at that.
Is there a concern that if you do focus on why indirect taxation has dropped or change any of the parameters, that might jeopardize or put into jeopardy Malaysia's standing as a competitive, attractive investment destination?
I would look at it this way. I mean, most countries also have those levels of taxation. I mean, we're almost the bottom quarter in the world, I think, in tax to GDP ratio.
Wow.
It's very low. We're below our peers in ASEAN, and some of them are a lot poorer than we are. We're below the OECD. I think we're almost right at the bottom of the OECD if we compare it to them. So the level of taxation is abnormally low. So some expansion of that, especially I think in terms of indirect taxation is necessary. We do need to look at how tax collection is actually conducted. So e-invoicing is actually quite important, right? To ensure that people are reporting correctly. I think to get more people into the formal sector is also quite important because tax returns are actually quite poor. I think the number of people who actually have an active file in LHDN is only about 6 million or so. They only have about 6 million files.
We have about 14 million in our...
16 million
16 million in our labour force.
So only 40% have a tax file.
Where are the other 60%, Hisham?
I don't know. That's something that we need to find out. Because even though a tax return is basically mandatory, it has never been enforced.
Okay.
Right? So the only people who actually provide tax returns on a regular basis are salaried workers. Right? I found, quite to my surprise, even my clerk at PMO doesn't file a tax return. So I told her to do it immediately.
Is it because they earn below the threshold?
They do.
So I read somewhere that I think so many Malaysians, millions of Malaysians earn below the threshold for...
Because the threshold is quite high, relatively speaking.
It's about 3,000?
3,000, but with all the release and everything, it's actually effectively 4,000 plus.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So at 4,000 plus, you're already roughly in the T20. So people in the M40 effectively mostly are not required to pay tax.
Which is another point that I thought was quite interesting, because when we talk about T15, you know, there's a lot of vilification around the Mahakaya who enjoy petrol subsidies and education subsidies and healthcare subsidies. But it's also the T15 that pay the most income tax revenue. They make up 80% of the income tax revenue of the country, funding social programs and you know, national development, essentially. So do you think that there's something that we need to balance the thinking about how they could be overly vilified?
I wouldn't say vilified.
Are the T15 the same as the Mahakaya?
No.
Okay.
No.
What's the difference in your perspective?
I would say Mahakaya is a 0.1%.
Got it.
Yeah. But I would say that the T15 are reasonably well off compared to the rest of Malaysia, right? So you can look at differences in cost of living between KL and everybody else, but the reality is that regardless, the standard of living in KL is so much higher than the rest of the country, and you're able to afford so much more, and I think that definition of middle class. People take it to mean a lot of very different things. But the official definition, I mean, this is the global definition of it, is you are meeting your basic wants. So in other words, you're above the poverty line. So if somebody's 100 ringgit above the poverty line, they're technically middle class. And if you're earning 10 times the average wage, you're also
Still
middle class.
Middle class. That is
So,
a big category.
Yeah, so and you know, there's a lot of obviously different values and attitudes between that. But to me, I think the key aspect of the T15 specifically is that you earn enough to be able to save. Whereas for most people below that, they don't. And if you're able to save a little bit and invest, then you're actually a whole lot better off than 80% of the rest of the country.
Okay. Well, I want to come back to the tax to GDP ratio, especially the conversation around expanding tax revenue, expanding the tax base. How much of a difference will dividend tax, the tax on dividend be?
That's on the Mahakaya.
That's on the Mahakaya, so that's taxing the Mahakaya. Is now not the right time for a broad-based consumption tax?
I would say, well, I think PM has come out very firmly that, that he thinks incomes needs to be higher before we do that.
3,000 to 4,000 higher. 3,000 to 4,000, that's significantly higher.
Yeah.
How do we think about that? I mean...
That's roughly within the next 10, 15 years.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. Well, it's doable.
Okay. So we have to wait for all incomes to be raised before we think of a more transparent and efficient tax system. And I'm quoting Prime Minister Anwar here, who referred to GST as that.
I mean, for him, it's a matter of principle, because under Islam, you cannot tax the poor. So as a result, MOF and the rest of us who are looking at tax are really looking at, okay, how do we do this without taxing the poor? It is technically possible to do a progressive consumption tax, technically.
Okay.
But it does require people to actually file a tax return, right? And unless we get there, then it's not really possible to do. So there are technical ways to do that. In the meantime, I would say, as far as this budget is concerned, we're looking at an evolution in the sense that we're trying to expand the tax base without overly impacting people's standard of living, right? So it's progressive. So you saw some expansion of sales service tax last year. You've seen a little bit more this year, and you continue to see expansion in the future. But it will be a gradual process to allow people to adjust.
We've focused a lot on removal of subsidies and more tax. What about wages? I mean, if it turns out that Malaysians will be essentially paying more out of their pockets, surely we need to do something about the amount of wages that we receive.
So I think, first of all, the minimum wage has been raised.
Okay.
That's very significant. There are obviously issues at micro industries, those with less than 5 employees, where they're not productive enough to manage those costs, which is why we've allowed them for a greater amount of time. Another 6 months or so. Having said that, I think the wage numbers are very encouraging already. I think since the government has taken over, we've been looking at an average of 7%, 8% increase in wage annually. So that's far exceeding the rate of inflation. So I think the wage growth is strong enough to be able to handle what we're doing, I think, in terms of expanding the tax base.
So in the couple of minutes that we have left, I do want to ask you, what would you like? I mean, you were part of the team behind this budget.
Well, I would say MOF mainly. We just
okay.
reviewed what they did.
What would you like people to understand about the budget? I mean, sometimes the conversations can meander, but what would you like most of us watching today at home to understand about the budget?
There is a strategy behind it.
There's a strategy.
Yes, and I think there's we are looking at progressively reducing the deficit, progressively improving the tax collection. A lot of the reforms that the government is doing is behind the door. I would say it's behind the walls, actually, because we're fixing the plumbing. We're fixing the toilets, right? It's not the big sexy stuff.
It's not the facade that we're,
it's not the big sexy stuff. It's, fixing the things that need to work, because the budget is one thing, because that's just allocation of expenditure. How do we spend it? How effectively we spend it? Those are things that the government's actually actively working on today. Reform of institutions, again, something we're working on quite seriously. Improvement, I think, in terms of the legislative framework, also being worked on. But there's only so much bandwidth, I think, in terms of capability of pushing out these reforms and you know, whether it's changes in acts or introduction of new acts, improvement, I think, in terms of delivery mechanism, and especially, I think, in terms of changing the culture of the civil service. This will all take time.
Okay. So is that all to say that there's more happening than we realize and we should be patient?
Because what's announced in the budget speech is maybe about 20% of the budget, right? We actually, I think there was 60 ETR or whatever it was, but we actually have something like 200 plus initiatives under the budget, and that also is just the discretionary part. There's a whole lot of other stuff that's going on as well that doesn't involve the financial aspects. Well,
if he did announce all of that in his budget speech, we would be in Parliament for 7 hours or so.
Yes, actually, he only read because I think we were quite careful about this. Okay, this is the whole speech of all the initiatives, but you only read the 2/3 of it.
Yes, we were following forward, and yes, he had to skip a lot, and it was already 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
Well, Hisham, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for allowing us an insight into some of the thinking behind Budget 2024.
My pleasure.
I appreciate it. Yeah. That's all we have for you today. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.